Thank you so much, first and foremost, for your support of PRS. It's so important that we be able to maintain a completely open, non-affiliated, non-sectarian center for the search. And that can extend to spiritual questions, it can extend to cultural questions, it can extend to the performing arts and all kinds of expositions, whether cinematic or dance based or sound based or um, working with um, puppeteering or dance troupes or any number of expressions. But in particular, Manly P. Hall founded PRS as a more or less really a public school for the esoteric search without connection to any particular organizational or religious affiliation or mission. And I probably wouldn't have found my way as a historian if it hadn't been for the influence of Manly P. Hall. I'll never forget very early on in, I suppose, in the stage of life that I'm in now. I was in adulthood. I was younger. I was getting interested in, or reinterested. My interest in esoteric and occult spirituality was reigniting, and I was seated at a table with two professional friends. One was a publisher, one was an author, and they had kind of been on the path a lot longer than I had at that point. And I said to them, "Who should I be reading?" And the woman at the table, whose name was Pythia, which was the name of the oracle at Delphi, the woman who would sit on the golden tripod and answer questions in a state of inebriation, she said to me, uh, Manly P. Hall. And I remember when I heard the name, it was almost like I fell into this ocean of curiosity, wanting to know who is the possessor of this stately polysyllabic name. And I immediately got my hands on a copy of Secret Teachings of All Ages. And I think that helped me understand at a very important time in young adulthood that the study of the esoteric could be a vocation in itself, could really be a vocation in itself. The hours are very long. The material rewards, they come, but they kind of go like that. They're very uneven. Um, but it could be done. And he showed me that it could be done. And that was very important to me. Um, I want to say a few words, I suppose, in a very informal way, in a very friendly way, about the nature of my search right now and what I'm working on in some of my books and appearances. And then I'm going to sort of open things up to exchange, and I'd hope to hear from some of you all on any theme or topic, any question or statement or what have you. Um, it seems to me that familiarity and the repetition of widely used terms and language greatly limits the search. Um, the architecture of the spiritual search, it seems to me, must be very, very free for the individual. And one of the things that curtails that freedom for all of us, I think, whatever outlook we come from, whatever our background or interests, it's this repetitive use of words that come too readily to the lips. Um, People will talk about concepts on the path like transcendence or transmutation or forgiveness, or some kind of self-realization. Or, for example, they might use a term like adept. And I find all those things very, very limiting because they put very strict parameters on what you, the individual, are going to find. And I think I'm at a phase of my search right now where I'm trying to be very, very frank with myself about what it is I want from life, this finite thing. I feel very strongly that, and very with great certainty, that there is an immaterial world. There is a world that is invisible, and I believe that it's as real as that one that we're occupying right now. That said, I don't know what my relationship is to that world following death. I'd like to presume there's some relationship, but I'm haunted in a good way by an observation that was made by a great graphic artist who you all may have heard of. I'm sure you have. Austin Osman Spare, who was seen somewhat as the granddaddy of chaos magic, and chaos because Spare too was a seeker who was trying to figure out ways of busting up convention, not as some nihilistic end to itself, but because convention can become so determinative of what answers you're going to come to. And Spare made an observation that I was very haunted by in a good way and I'm very interested in. He felt he was a very practical person. It's funny because his art is very avant-garde and it was very risque for the era. He died, I believe it was 1956. So for the early 20th century, his art, which was very sexually explicit, was considered very avant-garde. But he was a very practical person, as many avant-gardists are actually. And Spare made the observation that he too was certain that we human beings participate in a physical and extra-physical world, but he felt that the body was our only source of transmission or mediumship to that extra-physical world. We're sensate beings, and as such, we experience through our senses, including through senses that are not commonly honored or understood, like ESP or telepathy, all of which I feel very strongly are part of the human situation. But Spare said, and it was sobering, he said, if there's something that you wish to experience or accomplish, don't waste time because it may be that our only means of experience is the body. We just don't know. We just don't know. Again, I think that this extra physical world is one that we still have a relationship with after physical demise, but I don't know. I really don't know. So, I mean, for example, within the Hindu faith, Vedic faith, Buddhist faith, um, there are many different concepts of reincarnation, for example. Some classical Vedic texts really see reincarnation, just to cite an example, in a very impersonal way. Our bodies experience demise, this energy that makes up life, which Spare referred to as Kia. Um, this energy goes back to source and then gets reprocessed back into life. I mean, listen, in terms of modern science, we've known since Einstein that energy can't be destroyed. I mean, that's really what the equation um, E equals mc squared um, represents. E being energy equals um, mass times like a luminescence. He was drawing, C was drawn from a Latin word, uh, squared, equals energy. And energy um, it can move forward in velocity. In quantum physics, it can move backward. but it constantly is transformed and it cannot be destroyed. And so, interestingly enough, um, world-class science itself agrees that the energy that courses through the human body, even if a person just considers that electrical energy on the strictest, most physicalist terms, it's not destroyed. And within Vedism, that energy is very impersonal and it does get recycled, so to speak, back into something, some form of life, but not necessarily the personality. So now there are other branches of the Vedic faiths uh, that do see reincarnation as a personality based. And I think we have evidence for that too. In my book Modern Occultism, I write a little bit about the career of parapsychologist Ian Stevenson, who's now dead. And Stevenson created thousands of case files demonstrating very suggestive and likely cases of reincarnation, where you did have a personality-based reincarnation, where, for example, a child born in Pakistan might be speaking a language that he or she had never grown up speaking, might feature in his or her body um, birthmarks that are uncannily similar to like exit wounds, for example, of someone who died a violent death, who might have lived, let's say, in Bangladesh and spoken a different language, and yet the the meeting points are so extraordinary that it is suggestive, at least, of a personality-based reincarnation. But we don't really know. We don't really know. So I guess I'm thinking more about these issues nowadays than I've ever thought before. And I'm trying to ask myself, without any prejudice, because the prejudice that we bring to bear on ourselves is really very limiting. What do I want? What do I want from life? I invite you to ask that question with me. We do better when we do these things in groups. And it's interesting because I believe, and I focus on this with some decisiveness in my upcoming book, Practical Magic. I believe that we as seekers are very alienated from our own wishes. And I think that overcoming that alienation is within reach. It's so important because going back to the way that we use language, the way that language can reinforce limits in ourselves that we don't even really know are there. Even in the most private recesses of your mind or your psyche, and I see psyche as an amalgam of thought and emotion, even in the most private recesses of your psyche, if you were to ask yourself, what do I want out of life? I would say, at least speaking from personal experience, that there's a lot to overcome in terms of internalized peer pressure. Peer pressure is just a fact of life that every individual has to deal with. And I very frequently encourage people, and I work on this myself, to try to, in relaxed moments, whether it be periods of meditation or periods maybe just before you're falling to sleep at night, just before you're waking up in the morning, times of real bodily relaxation, try to peel back the onion and recollect what your wishes were from your earliest cognizant memories. We probably hold memories, I'm sure we hold memories in our body that predate, that precede um, the psyche, the memories that we hold in our psyche. And yet the bodily memories, they're not always so easy to get at. That can take a long time to get at. It's a lot to strip away. But the memories of the psyche, because they've entered our whatever this apparatus is that we call a long-term memory, it seems to me that they're more easily accessed. And it seems to me, at least based on my own experience, and I can't imagine my life is exceptional, the memories that I have from earliest on really go back even to age 3, maybe a little, maybe 9 months into age 3, but they are there. And if you look at those things, um, you may catch a glimpse of who you really are prior to peer pressure, because peer pressure just it really tamps down on people. A friend of mine, Ptolemy Tompkins, who's a great esoteric writer, he said, I mean, this is just a personal impression. I don't know whether this is an absolute truth, but it was his impression that by the time a kid is age 9 going forward, as he said it, by the time a kid stops uh, talking to themselves in the bathtub. I don't know if you talk to yourselves in the bathtub, but I used to. And by the time a kid stops talking to themselves in the bathtub around age 9, because they're embarrassed, they don't want somebody to hear, that's when peer pressure has you. And it's very tough. But if you can capture that wish that you had from the very earliest points of conscious memory and cognition, you might really find something remarkable. You might find something about what you really want. My suggestion is when you find that, keep it a secret. Don't tell anybody, because the first thing they'll do is take it from you. The first thing they'll do, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. What about that? Or what about service? Or, you'll get hit with one of these words that we love to use to limit people. And I think we have to be very private in certain parts of our lives, not go around talking about this stuff, because you may find a wish that doesn't read well to your peer group, and save us from our peer groups. No sooner do we find our way to a subculture that's supposed to be liberating, then that subculture comes up with all kinds of rules and faction splits, and everybody wants to be in charge. And, just because people are in a subculture doesn't mean that they're not uh, bullies or obstinate or bossy or whatever. And people love enforcing rules. We love telling one another what to do. When all else fails, tell someone else what to do. Tell someone else what's wrong with them. So keep it private. Keep it private, and and don't worry if it clashes with what you're supposed to believe, because every at every juncture on the road in the search, somebody somehow somewhere is trying to impose their limits on us. you know uh that we're expected to think like this person or that person or whatever. And I've noticed I will be very open about sharing things on social media, spiritual, things of like a spiritual nature, because I'm workshopping it. It's like I don't mind people commenting. Inevitably, there's going to be people who are happy, unhappy. Uh, I'm workshopping it. I'm workshopping it. But I do find that a lot of what people bring to the table when you share something about a spiritual goal or a life goal or a goal on the path, whatever it may be, um, you'll start, at least this has been my experience, um, people want to school you using kind of catechism. I remember several years ago, I wrote a very controversial article, so much so I couldn't even find anybody to publish it. Um, and it's become one of the most popular things I ever wrote. It was an article taking a second look narrative of forgiveness. We've all been wounded, we've all suffered, and there are certain spiritual traditions, Christianity, chief above all, that emphasize forgiveness. So, and that's true in the 12-step movement too. And I really respect the 12-step movement, and I love the 12-step movement. Um, but first and foremost, in the 12-step movement, your task is one of forgiveness. This is also true within Course in Miracles, the channel teaching, a wonderful teaching. And I know a lot of people who have worked with the Course in Miracles who have really found something in it. It hasn't been for me. The Course like really emphasizes forgiveness. And I've thought to I started feeling to myself, a friend of mine, Richard Smoley, a great scholar of esotericism, and very deeply invested in Course in Miracles. Richard wrote a book, which I published, called The Deal. And The Deal, which I recommend reading, is a very thin book based on Course in Miracles. In fact, I would say, in my estimation, it's probably the thinnest, shortest, most practical interpretation of Course in Miracles. And the deal is that since it's a given that we all hurt one another, albeit and forgiveness to others who have hurt us. And I read this book and I was very excited by it because I felt it had great integrity. It's very simple, it's very powerful, it's very strong. And I worked with this book for probably about 5 years, just to give you an idea of why I came to this position. And I kept working with it and working with it and working with it. It's a very good book. And it didn't do anything for me. It left me cold. It was 5 years of effort. And I'm glad I made that effort. And I began to wonder, how do I know, as a 21st century person, that forgiveness, just for example, is this turnkey, to escaping the cycle of my bad karma, or to feeling more at home in myself or whatever. And it struck me, this is just my point of view. I don't know if this is necessarily for everybody, but it struck me that the value of abiding might be more productive than the value of forgiveness. In other words, um, for me, using that hurt, whatever it is, as a goad, as a goad to attaining something that's of hallowed value to me in my own life, whatever that is, whatever that is. Um, Neville Goddard, who's a New Thought mystic, I have him tattooed somewhere. Yeah, here he is. Uh, I've always loved him. Neville died in 1972, and he came to the United States at age 17 from the island of Barbados in the Caribbean to study theater. And at that young age, his accent was a little different than it was when he got older. It was a rounder, rural, um, Caribbean British accent. And it really was a kind of a rural accent. And it was not always easy for him to be understood. And he said he went to a drama school here in New York City, where I'm speaking from. Um, it may have been American Academy of Dramatic Arts, but whatever it was, he said his father had given him $500 or $600. This was back in the 1920s. Yeah, yeah, early 20s, to go to this school. And he said the first day of school, a very cruel teacher called him up to the front of the classroom, and she announced to the class, "Now this is a man who will never earn a living using his voice. And he was mortified because she was making fun of his British Barbadian accent. He's 17 years old. What's he supposed to do about his accent? And Neville said, and you'd be surprised because if you listen to Neville's talks, which are very widespread online, he speaks with this mellifluous, beautiful mid-Atlantic accent. He sounds like he should be off hosting Masterpiece Theater somewhere. You know, you couldn't imagine that somebody would criticize his accent from a perspective of the stage. Um, but it sounded a little different when he was a kid. And Neville said, I decided, you know, at that very moment, right then and there, that I would make a living using my voice and that I would not go down into the grave as this woman wanted, but I would make a living using my voice. And the truth is, Neville is one of the most widely listened to spiritual orators of the 20th century. You put his name into Google. He had the foresight, first of all, to allow people to use early recording technology to record his talks, which I thought was just brilliant. And so all this recording technology, reel-to-reel tapes and stuff, existed after his death. It was digitized. Neville is so widely listened to today, you'd be hard pressed to find another orator or speaker who is as widely listened to as Neville. So it worked. I don't know whether he forgave the teacher or not. He certainly didn't mention anything about it. And I liked that. You know, I liked that. But when I wrote this article questioning the imperative of forgiveness, the original title was Forgiveness, a Dissent. It was as if I was canceling Christmas or something, you know. I mean, it was, you know, as if I had just pushed Santa Claus down a flight of stairs. I mean, people were outraged. And there was a woman who wrote to me and said, I really appreciate your writing that article because she said, whenever I voice a question about the imperative of forgiveness, it evokes such um, pushback and calumny, even from people who are total strangers and have no stake whatsoever in my life. You know, who cares whether I forgive my first grade teacher or not? You know, I mean, of what cost is that to some guy named Mike out in Nebraska who's angry at me? You know, like, and I've had the same experience, and it's very interesting because I think we orient our lives along this kind of architecture of thought, these shelf units of thought. You know, forgiveness is good, and anybody who questions it is sort of undermining the sense of the individual as to what's good. Um, so I'm focusing a lot of my search on this today. Um, I'm um, I'm making the effort to not get caught up in language and to not allow religious traditions or customs, however hallowed, however widespread, however frequently repeated, to color my sense of wish. And I want to close very quickly with one more anecdote in hopes that this may be helpful. Um, it's funny, I gave a talk about this not long, well, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago at PRS. I was talking about feeling a great division in my own search at one time because I had two teachers, both dead, that I was really looking to. One was Neville, and one is a man who died in 1992 named Vernon Howard. And Vernon was a very beautiful thinker, a wonderful, wonderful man. But I would say that at the end of the road, you know, Vernon felt unlike perhaps what I was describing in Austin Osman Spare, Vernon felt like this world that we live in, the world that we occupy, it's illusion, it's samsara, it's Maya. It doesn't matter. It's a point of view that would have fit in very well with classical Buddhism, classical Christianity. Don't get hung up on chasing these baubles and titles and goodies in the world because it's all illusion. It's all going to go away. And I would find there were some weeks where I was believing Neville, and there were some weeks where I was believing Vernon. And it was rending me in two because although I think Neville and Vernon are ultimately in agreement, Neville really places a greater emphasis on, um, I guess Neville felt that you would learn your own transcendental nature by exercising the creative faculties of the mind in such a way that you realize that everything that you witness is an outpicturing of you, including the words I'm speaking right now. Whereas Vernon, his emphasis was more, if you get caught up in the goodies of the world, whatever it may be, you're lost. You're in trouble. You are lost. And I couldn't. I kept, even though I know I think both roads lead to Rome, so to speak. The approaches were different, and a person. I felt torn apart. Felt torn apart. But something happened in my life. It was a little thing, and it was very clarifying for me. And it was this. Um, One day I was coming back from vacation, and I flew in to with my kids to Kennedy Airport in New York City. Worst place to fly into if you're returning from vacation. I mean, it was worse then than it is now. It's noisy, it's dirty. Um, there's rushing, there's screaming. People are blowing whistles and moving cabs along, and it's like ah. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was working in publishing at that time, and I had a lot of pressure on my shoulders. Um, and I was not a happy camper. I was depressed. Um, I had been in some sunny climate, and I was back in slushy, grimy New York City, and everybody was screaming and hostile. And I had work the next day, and I made a decision not to check my email uh, because it always stressed me out. I found publishing very stressful to work in, and whatever the reason was, I thought, oh, I'll just check my email. And I checked my email, and to my pleasant surprise, instead of somebody sharing some horrible problem with me, there was a producer from an NPR show. Um, I think it was called Interfaith Voices, and she wanted to do a show about miracles, and she needed to book guests for like the next day, and they already had a yes from a guy named Father James Martin, who's a Jesuit priest. And, they wanted the weirdos to be heard from. So she was like, would you come on and, talk about miracles? And I said that I would. And I felt very fortunate that I did check my email. Otherwise, I would have overlooked it. And so here's the funny thing. Uh, Got in that taxi cab, went home, got the kids bathed and fed and, what have you. Um, and, um, And I started working on this question of miracles, researching it. Um, I'm very interested in this process by which the Catholic Church beatifies saints. It's a five-step process. And I started looking at that, and I knew I was going to be on with a Catholic saint. So um, I didn't want to make some casual reference to something that, I didn't fully understand, at least from an academic perspective. And as I was doing my work, I realized I was in a wonderful mood. I mean, everything lifted, everything lifted. I felt great. And I think that there would have been somebody, from a religious perspective who would have said to me, oh, there you go again, just grasping for little baubles. Don't you love being an NPR? Don't you love that microphone in front of you? Don't, blah, 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 and it would have been taken away from me. And I thought to myself, I don't know that this is temporal. I don't know that. I know I was depressed earlier. I felt like hell, and I feel really good now. I suspect it would be very foolish and knee-jerk for me to ignore that. I don't know that's temporal. And I knew at that juncture that my heart belonged to Neville, even if I still love Vernon, and I do. Um, I'm not prepared to dismiss outer life as these baubles and meaningless trinkets and titles and vanity and blah 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 blah. I'm not prepared to do that. I don't know that I'm right, but I do know that it felt like it would have been a real mishap, a real mistake to dismiss the experience I've just described to you as temporal, especially when I noticed such a really extraordinary contrast. Now, someone could turn around and say to me, yeah, but I bet, 48 hours later you were depressed again. And it's like, well, yo, maybe, but I ask, hypothetically, to the hypothetical you, do you know anyone who doesn't get depressed? Do you know anyone who doesn't feel anxiety? That's why I don't really dig these terms like adept or realized or awakened, because having been on this path for a long time, I have never met anybody like that. And I won't assume that someone's like that unless I've been around that person in times of great stress, times of great suffering, because that's really the only time we stand naked, in front of one another. And I have a friend who's he runs a dojo, a martial arts studio, uh, in another part of Brooklyn. And he is a master of the martial art Aikido. And his tradition is Japanese Aikido. And in Japan, Aikido is very tied in to Buddhism. And he spent a lot of time in some very old Buddhist monasteries. And I said to him once, listen, you've been doing this a long time. Have you ever on the path met a realized person? No. So I have to work with the material that's available to me. Um, I can't accept someone else's judgment or testimony on the matter. I personally think it's asking too much of the individual that he or she be beyond depression, beyond anxiety. I mean, there may be such figures within our modern era, maybe the great Hindu sage Ramana Maharshi might have been one of those figures. But Ramana Maharshi was a renunciate. He lived in a loincloth. He ate food that people brought to him. He lived a life that is not within my reach at this juncture of my existence, especially as a Western person. And so maybe, but the fact that something makes me happy and then 2 days later or a day later or an hour later, I'm unhappy again. I don't know that that unearths corruption on that um, particular path that I've sought, because I think that that's just the human situation. I think that's just the human situation. Um, we may speak again in a year, and I may have a different point of view on that. But I say this because I just really wish to describe to you this particular stage in my own search, both as a writer and as a person who's seeking. I really want to free myself and all of us as much as possible from prejudice, repetition, catechism, and off-the-shelf phrases. And I want to see people get in touch with their wishes. And I want to see people make sure that they protect those wishes and not have somebody take them away from them because they don't meet with um, the approval or the orthodoxy of whatever subculture we belong to. Um, and I ask you and I ask myself to give yourself a break. Give yourself a break. If you wish something and it seems very unspiritual, um, just take it easy on yourself, take it easy on yourself because within that thing that you've wished for, whatever it may be, maybe something very, very, very important, something really necessary, for you. Um, Too often, I think we want people to function as idealized rather than as they really are. Um, People always piss all over the movie and book The Secret because they say, oh, the end of the spiritual search shouldn't be getting a Mercedes Benz. I always hear that. There's not a Mercedes Benz in the movie, not once. And, um, the notion that I could understand, though, what that mythical Mercedes Benz or whatever else it would mean would stand for in the life of another person is that's for them to deal with. That's for them to grok to. Um, that's just one example. I mean, it doesn't have to be material at all. But whatever it is, take it easy on yourself. Because the thing in you that's saying, "Oh, that's not spiritual," or "That's not good," that just may be internalized peer pressure, and that can be a barrier, I think, on the path, a barrier that we abide ourselves, and a barrier that we can break. Um, so I offer that to you. You'll see some of this reflected in practical magic, and because I think a focused wish is so important, so important.